The millionaire CEO was having dinner at a restaurant, until a little girl left a note that broke his heart. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. Now, sit back and enjoy this beautiful story. Alexander Reynolds tapped his finger against the rim of his crystal wine glass, barely listening to the droning voices around him. The Pinnacle restaurant's dim lighting cast shadows across the faces of investment bankers, eager to please the CEO of Reynolds Enterprises. At 42, Alexander had mastered the art of appearing engaged, while his mind calculated 3 moves ahead. If we proceed with the Asian market expansion next quarter, someone was saying. Alexander nodded automatically, his piercing blue eyes scanning the elegant room. Everything in his life ran according to plan. Every decision calculated, every risk measured. His empire had been built on this precision. The waiter appeared silently at his side, removing the appetizer plate. As the porcelain lifted, Alexander noticed something underneath, a folded piece of paper. Curious, he picked it up while maintaining his practiced smile. "Excuse me," he said, unfolding the note beneath the table. The handwriting was childish, but neat. "My mother Vanessa said that she would die without you knowing about me. I have your birthmark in your eyes. She passed away last week. I'm at Crown Hills Orphanage. Signed, Olivia." Alexander's hand froze. The conversation around him faded to white noise. Vanessa, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in nearly a decade. Their relationship had been intense, passionate, until his company demanded everything from him. He'd chosen ambition over love, never looking back. "Mr. Reynolds, about the projection figures." Alexander stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood. "I need to leave. Family emergency." The words felt foreign in his mouth. Family. He'd never used that excuse before. 20 minutes later, his Bentley pulled up to Crown Hills Orphanage. A stark brick building with windows that glowed yellow against the night sky. Alexander sat motionless for a moment, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Inside, a tired-looking woman led him down a hallway to a small office. "She left instructions to contact you if anything happened to her," the director explained, sliding a folder across her desk. "Vanessa kept your information, though she never reached out." "Where is she?" Alexander's voice was barely controlled. "Olivia." The girl who entered minutes later stopped Alexander's heart. 8 years old, with blonde hair falling around a delicate face. But it was her eyes, startlingly blue and penetrating, that made his breath catch. His own eyes, looking back, at him with cautious hope. She extended her small wrist, revealing a crescent-shaped birthmark identical to his own. "Hello," she said quietly. "I'm Olivia." The empire builder, the man who controlled boardrooms with a glance, found himself speechless. In that moment, Alexander Reynolds realized that all his billions meant nothing compared to the small girl standing before him, the daughter he never knew he had. Alexander stared at Olivia, his mind racing to process the reality standing before him. The small office in Crown Hills Orphanage seemed to shrink around them as the director, Mrs. Bennett, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I understand this is quite a shock, Mr. Reynolds," she said, breaking the silence. "Perhaps you'd like a moment alone with Olivia?" Alexander nodded numbly, unable to tear his gaze from the girl's face. Mrs. Bennett stepped out, closing the door softly behind her. "How did you find me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Olivia's small fingers twisted the hem of her faded, blue sweater. "Mom kept a box with your letters and some newspaper clippings. She showed me your picture before she..." Her voice wavered slightly. "Before she got really sick." Alexander sank into a chair, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter. His daughter. The concept was still impossible to grasp. "Vanessa never told me about you," he said, the words heavy with regret and a hint of anger. "Why didn't she tell me?" Olivia shrugged, her eyes, so unnervingly like his own, watching him carefully. "She said you were building important things, that you had your own life." She paused. "And that someday when I was old enough I could decide if I wanted to find you." Alexander felt a sharp pang in his chest. Vanessa had protected him from responsibility while sacrificing herself. It was so like her, generous to a fault, even toward the man who had abandoned her. When did your mother? He couldn't finish. The sentence? 9 days ago, Olivia replied with the straightforward clarity of children discussing unbearable things. Cancer. She fought for a long time. Mrs. Bennet returned with a folder of documents. Vanessa Carter named you as Olivia's father on her birth certificate, though she never pursued any legal acknowledgement or support. She slid several papers across her desk. These are the guardianship forms. Of course, we'll need to verify paternity officially, though the resemblance is, she glanced between them, quite convincing. Alexander barely heard her. His mind was calculating with the same precision he applied to business. Vanessa had been gone for 9 days. Olivia had been alone in an orphanage for 9 days. His child had been mourning her mother with no family to comfort her. I want to take her home, he said abruptly. Tonight. Mrs. Bennet blinked in surprise. Mr. Reynolds, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, there are procedures. I have a team of lawyers who can handle any procedures. Alexander cut in. But I'm not leaving my daughter here another night. Olivia's eyes widened slightly, watching this exchange without comment. This isn't something to rush into, Mrs. Bennet cautioned. Becoming a parent overnight is challenging, especially for someone with your lifestyle. What do you mean by that? Alexander's voice carried the edge that had intimidated countless business rivals. I mean, Mrs. Bennet continued steadily, that raising a child requires presence, patience, and prioritizing their needs above your own. Your reputation suggests a certain devotion to your work. Alexander felt a flash of irritation, then unexpected doubt. She wasn't wrong. His life was ordered around conference calls, international flights, and 18-hour workdays. There was no space for a child in that existence. He looked at Olivia again. She stood quietly, her small suitcase already packed beside her, as if she'd been waiting, hoping, but preparing for disappointment. I'll figure it out, he said with finality. Where do I sign? 2 hours and several phone calls later, Alexander led Olivia toward his car, temporary guardianship papers secured. His assistant was already arranging for his penthouse to accommodate a child, something it had never been designed to do. As they approached the Bentley, Olivia hesitated. Is something wrong? Alexander asked. She looked up at him, vulnerability plain on her face. Are you sure you want me? The question caught him off guard, direct and devastating in its simplicity. Alexander kneeled down, meeting her gaze. Olivia, he said, choosing his words carefully, I didn't know about you until tonight. I have no idea how to be a father. He took a breath. But yes, I want you. We'll figure this out together. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Okay, she said simply, and climbed into the car. As Alexander drove toward a future he couldn't possibly imagine, he gripped the steering wheel tight enough to whiten his knuckles. He was terrified, but something else was emerging, a fierce determination that this child who carried his eyes in his blood would never doubt her place in his world again. Alexander's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek downtown high-rise, a monument to modern luxury and meticulous design. Every piece of furniture, every artwork had been carefully selected to project success and sophistication. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was unnecessary. Until now. As the elevator doors opened directly into his foyer, Alexander watched Olivia take in her surroundings. Her eyes widened at the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering city skyline, the minimalist furnishings in shades of gray and black, the abstract sculptures that cost more than most homes. This is where you live? She asked, her voice small in the vast space. Yes, Alexander replied, suddenly seeing his home through different eyes. There were no photographs, no personal touches, nothing that suggested a life beyond work. Olivia clutched her small suitcase tighter, looking. impossibly tiny against the backdrop of his carefully curated world. "Let me show you your room," he said, leading her down a hallway. The guest bedroom was as impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, all clean lines and neutral tones. Alexander flicked on the lights, revealing a king-sized bed that would dwarf Olivia's small frame, and windows that offered the same spectacular view as the living room. "It's very big," Olivia observed, setting her suitcase carefully on the floor. "We'll make it more." "Suitable tomorrow," Alexander promised, realizing he had no idea what a child's room should look like. "Do you need help unpacking?" She shook her head. "I don't have much." The statement hung between them, a reminder of the vast differences in their lives. Alexander cleared his throat. "Are you hungry?" Olivia shrugged. "A little." In the kitchen, Alexander stared at his refrigerator's contents. Expensive wine, gourmet takeout containers, and little else. He wasn't even sure what children ate. After an awkward moment, he reached for his phone. "I'll order something. What do you like?" "Anything is fine," Olivia replied, perching carefully on a bar stool, her legs dangling above the floor. They ate Thai food at his dining table, which had never been used for an actual family meal. Alexander watched Olivia carefully cut her food into small pieces, her table manners surprisingly precise for an 8-year-old. "Did your mother teach you to eat like that?" he asked, immediately regretting mentioning Vanessa so casually. Olivia nodded. "Mom said good manners matter more than fancy things." The simple wisdom struck Alexander deeply. Vanessa had always valued authenticity over appearances. An uncomfortable silence settled between them until Olivia spoke again. "Mr. Reynolds?" "You can call me Alexander," he said quickly. "Or—" He hesitated. "Whatever makes you comfortable." She studied him with those disconcertingly familiar blue eyes. "Alexander," she tested the name. "Is this just for now, or will I stay here? For good?" The question caught him off guard. In the whirlwind of the evening, he hadn't thought beyond the immediate future. "This is your home now, Olivia," he heard himself say with more certainty than he felt. "For as long as you want it to be." She seemed to weigh his words carefully before nodding. "Okay." Later, as Alexander stood in the doorway of the guest room watching Olivia arrange her few possessions, some clothes, a worn teddy bear, and a framed photo of Vanessa, he felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. For a man who had spent his life in control, who had built an empire on calculated decisions, Alexander Reynolds had just made the most impulsive choice of his life, and he had absolutely no idea what would come next. Alexander couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, the note, the orphanage, those blue eyes that mirrored his own. After hours of tossing and turning, he gave up and wandered to his home office, a space dominated by award plaques and business journals. In the bottom drawer of his desk, locked away for years, was a box he'd never quite been able to discard. He hesitated before opening it, already knowing the contents would reopen wounds he'd long convinced himself had healed. Inside lay the remnants of his life with Vanessa, concert tickets, handwritten notes, a watercolor sketch she'd made of him laughing, something he rarely did anymore. Alexander lifted a small, worn photograph. Vanessa on the beach, her blonde hair whipping in the wind, her smile radiant. She had been sunshine personified, her artist's soul so different from his, methodical mind. "You should have told me," he whispered to the photograph, anger mingling with grief. "She's been alone for 9 days, Vanessa. 9 days. The memory of their final argument surfaced with painful clarity. Vanessa standing in his apartment, tears streaming down her face. "You have to choose, Alex. Your empire or a life with me. I can't keep being the one who waits." He had chosen his company without hesitation. Reynolds Enterprises had been in its critical growth phase. He couldn't be distracted, couldn't divide his focus. By the time he'd realized what he'd lost, his pride had prevented him from looking back. And now, 9 years later, he discovered that choice had cost him far more than he'd ever imagined. A soft sound from the doorway pulled him from his thoughts. Olivia stood there in oversized pajamas someone from his staff had hastily purchased. Her blonde hair, Vanessa's hair, mussed from sleep. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I heard a noise." Alexander hastily closed the box. "It's all right. Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head, her eyes falling on the photograph he still held. "That's Mom." "Yes," Alexander said softly. "From a long time ago." Olivia entered the room cautiously as if uncertain of her welcome. "She kept a picture of you too, by her bed." Something tightened in Alexander's chest. "She did?" Nodding, Olivia climbed onto the leather sofa across from his desk. "She said you had important things to do, that you were building something big." Her fingers traced patterns on the leather. "She said I had your eyes." Alexander studied her face, the delicate features that were clearly Vanessa's, but those eyes, unmistakably his own. What else had he passed on to this child he'd never known? His determination? His stubborn pride? "Did she?" he began, uncertain how to phrase it. "Did she talk about me often?" Olivia considered this. "Sometimes, mostly when I asked. She wasn't mad at you, if that's what you're wondering. But she should have been," Alexander thought. "She had every right to be. She said you'd be a good dad someday." Olivia continued. "When you were ready." The words felt like a physical blow. Had Vanessa known she was dying? Had she somehow orchestrated this meeting from beyond, giving him one final chance to prove her right? "It's late," he said gently, unable to process the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You should try to get some sleep." Olivia nodded and slid off the couch. At the door, she paused. "Alexander?" "Yes?" "I'm glad I found you." After she left, Alexander sat motionless, the photograph still in his hand. For a man who prided himself on never missing opportunities, he'd missed the most important one of all, being there for Vanessa and their daughter. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would begin making things right. Morning arrived with the harsh reality that Alexander Reynolds, master of billion-dollar acquisitions, had absolutely no idea how to care for an 8-year-old girl. He stood in his kitchen, staring into his refrigerator as if it might suddenly produce a child-appropriate breakfast. "Do you have any cereal?" Olivia asked, appearing beside him in yesterday's clothes, her hair pulled back in a slightly lopsided ponytail. Alexander closed the refrigerator. "I don't think so. I usually just have coffee." Olivia nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected about him. "Mom said you can't think properly without breakfast." The innocent comment so casually delivered made his chest tighten. How many other little nuggets of wisdom had Vanessa shared about him? She was right, he conceded. "Let's go out for breakfast, and then we need to get you some things." An hour later, they were walking through a department store, a completely foreign experience for Alexander. He typically had personal shoppers handle such mundane tasks. Now, surrounded by children's clothing, he felt oddly vulnerable. "Pick whatever you like," he said, gesturing vaguely around them. Olivia looked up at him uncertainly. "Anything?" "Of course." She bit her lip, then moved cautiously through the racks, occasionally touching a sleeve or a collar but selecting nothing. After several minutes of this hesitation, Alexander realized the problem. "Olivia," he said gently, crouching to her eye level, "you don't need to worry about the cost." She shifted uncomfortably. "Mom always said to check the price tag first." Another knife twist of reality. While he'd been amassing wealth, Vanessa had been teaching their daughter financial caution. That was good advice, he acknowledged. But today is different. This is necessary, not extra. Slowly, Olivia began selecting items, practical choices mostly, nothing frivolous. She checked with him before each addition, her eyes seeking approval until he insisted she didn't need to ask. As they moved through departments gathering essentials, Alexander felt increasingly out of his depth. What else did children need? School, supplies, books, toys. His assistant had already arranged for a proper bed to be delivered, but what about the other aspects of a child's room? In the toy section, Olivia finally showed genuine interest, her eyes lighting up at an art set with paints, brushes, and a small easel. "Do you like to paint?" Alexander asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded. "Mom taught me. She said it helps put feelings on paper when words are too hard." Alexander added the art set to their cart without hesitation. "You inherited that from her. She was very talented." "I know," Olivia said softly. She sold paintings sometimes when bills were tight. Each casual revelation was another reminder of how different their lives had been, his filled with excess, theirs with careful budgeting. Now these worlds were colliding, with an 8-year-old girl caught in between. Back at the penthouse, Alexander watched as Olivia carefully organized her new belongings, hanging clothes with precision, arranging books by size, setting up her art supplies near the window for good light, just as Vanessa would have done. "Is this okay?" she asked, gesturing to the small space she'd claimed in his immaculate home. Alexander looked at the splashes of color now brightening the formerly sterile guest room. Purple bedding, a blue lamp, colorful books, and art supplies. "It's more than okay," he said truthfully. "It makes this place feel like a home." Olivia smiled, a small, tentative smile that nonetheless transformed her face. In that moment, Alexander realized that while he might be providing for her basic needs, she was filling a void in his life he hadn't even recognized was there. 3 days into their new arrangement, a delicate routine began to form. Alexander had cleared his schedule as much as possible, delegating meetings and postponing business trips, actions that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. His executive team was confused by the sudden change, but he offered minimal explanation. The press hadn't yet discovered Olivia's existence, and he intended to keep it that way as long as possible. Each morning, Alexander woke early, answered critical emails, and then prepared a simple breakfast before Olivia emerged from her room. Their meals were quiet affairs, but the silence had begun to feel less strained. "I need to enroll you in school," Alexander said over toast and eggs. The education coordinator recommended several options. Olivia pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate. "Will it be soon? Do you miss school?" he asked, realizing he knew almost nothing about her academic life. She shrugged. "I like learning, but kids sometimes ask questions when things are different." Alexander understood immediately. Questions about her mother and now questions about suddenly living with a father who had been absent for 8 years. "We'll find somewhere good," he promised. "Somewhere you'll feel comfortable." That evening, as Alexander worked in his home office, a piercing cry shattered the quiet. He bolted from his chair and raced to Olivia's room, his heart pounding. She was thrashing in her sleep, tears streaming down her face. "Mom," she cried, "don't go." Alexander froze in the doorway, paralyzed by the raw grief in her voice. This was beyond his expertise. Spreadsheets and market projections couldn't help here. "Olivia," he said softly, approaching her bed. "Olivia, wake up. It's just a dream." Her eyes flew open, disoriented and fearful. For a moment she looked confused by his presence, as if expecting someone else. Then reality crashed back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping tears with small fists. "Don't apologize," Alexander said, sitting awkwardly on the edge of her bed. "Bad dreams are normal." She nodded, pulling her knees to her chest. The silence stretched between them until Alexander, with no clue what else to do, simply reached out and took her small hand in his. To his surprise, Olivia didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his, holding on as if to anchor herself. They sat like that, connected by this simple touch, until her breathing steadied and the tension in her shoulders eased. "Would you like some water?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Could you just stay a little longer?" So Alexander Reynolds, CEO of a global enterprise, sat holding his daughter's hand until she fell back asleep, client calls and quarterly projections forgotten. The next morning, Alexander found a drawing on his desk, a slightly awkward but unmistakable portrait of him, rendered in careful strokes of colored pencil. At the bottom, Olivia had written, "Thank you for staying." Alexander studied the portrait, noting how she'd captured his serious expression but had somehow added a softness to his eyes that he hadn't seen in mirrors for years. Was that how she saw him? Or how she hoped he could be? He framed the drawing and placed it on his desk, the first truly personal item to ever occupy that space. Later that day, his assistant Rebecca noticed it during a briefing. "New art acquisition?" she asked casually. "Something better," Alexander replied. "Something priceless." That evening, for the first time since Olivia's arrival, Alexander found himself smiling without conscious effort as he listened to her describe a character from her book. A small connection had formed, fragile as gossamer, but real nonetheless. Neither of them realized yet how significantly it would change them both. The protective bubble Alexander had created around their newfound routine burst on a Tuesday morning. His phone buzzed with urgent messages from his PR director. "Call immediately. Story breaking about your daughter." Alexander's stomach dropped. He'd known this moment would come, but had hoped for more time. Time for Olivia to adjust. Time for him to figure out how to shield her from the inevitable scrutiny. "Mr. Reynolds," his PR director said when he called, "the Daily Chronicle is running a piece tomorrow. Billionaire's secret love child discovered. They have photos of you and Olivia at the department store. We need a statement." Alexander glanced at Olivia's closed bedroom door. She was getting ready for her first day at Westridge Academy, an exclusive private school where he hoped she might find stability. "Release nothing," he instructed. "No confirmations, no denials. I'll handle this myself." When Olivia emerged wearing her new uniform, navy blazer with the school crest, pleated skirt, hair neatly brushed, Alexander felt a surge of protectiveness, unlike anything he'd experienced before. "You look very official," he said, attempting lightness. She tugged at her collar nervously. "Is it okay if I'm scared?" The simple honesty of her question caught him off guard. In his world, admitting fear was taboo, a weakness to be concealed at all costs. "Of course it's okay," he said. "New beginnings are always a little scary." During the car ride, he debated whether to warn her about the media story. Would it be better for her to be prepared, or would it only add to her anxiety about the first day? "Olivia," he began carefully, "there might be some attention coming our way, about you living with me." She looked up from her lap. "What kind of attention?" "The newspapers sometimes write stories about me, about my work and my personal life." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Because you're important." "Because I'm rich," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." When they arrived at Westridge, Alexander walked her to the administration building, aware of the curious glances from other parents. The headmistress greeted them warmly, but he detected the subtle shift in her demeanor when she recognized him. The slightly straighter posture, the more deliberate smile. "We're delighted to welcome Olivia," she said. "I've arranged for our student ambassador to show her around." A girl about Olivia's age appeared, bright-eyed and confident. "Hi, I'm Madison. We're in the same class." As Olivia prepared to leave with Madison, she hesitated, then quickly wrapped her arms around Alexander's waist in a brief hug. "Bye," she whispered before following her guide. The unexpected gesture left Alexander momentarily stunned. It was their first hug, awkward and fleeting but unmistakably significant. By afternoon, the story had exploded. Alexander's security team reported photographers stationed outside both his office building and the penthouse. His phone rang constantly, with calls from board members concerned about the company image and investors worried about his focus. When he picked Olivia up from school, she climbed silently into the car. "How was your first day?" he asked. She stared out the window. "Madison asked if it was true that you didn't want me until my mom died." Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." Her voice was small. "Is it true?" The question hung between them, devastating in its simplicity. Traffic crawled around them as Alexander struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know about you," he finally said. If I had known, things would have been different. How different? She pressed. Alexander looked at his daughter, truly, looked at her and spoke from a place of honesty he rarely accessed. I don't know, Olivia. But I'm glad you're here now. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the truth. And in a world where appearances often mattered more than reality, perhaps that was what they both needed most. Alexander sat in his office, staring at the acquisition proposal that would cement Reynolds Enterprises as the dominant force in international markets. The Singapore deal represented everything he'd worked for: global expansion, unprecedented profit margins, and the board chairmanship he'd coveted for years. There was just one problem. Closing the deal would require his presence in Asia for at least 3 weeks, 3 weeks away from Olivia. Mr. Reynolds? Rebecca stood in the doorway. The board is waiting in the conference room. Alexander nodded, straightening his tie. Has the school called? Nothing today, Rebecca replied. She hesitated, then added, Olivia's art show is still on the calendar for next Friday. Should I adjust your schedule? The art show. Olivia had mentioned it just once, casually over breakfast. My painting was selected for the student showcase. She hadn't asked if he would attend, hadn't made a point of the date or time. It was as if she was protecting herself from potential disappointment. Keep it on the calendar, Alexander said firmly. In the boardroom, 12 expectant faces turned toward him as he entered. These were people who had known only the driven, uncompromising Alexander Reynolds, a man for whom personal considerations were never a factor in business decisions. Gentlemen, he began, the Singapore acquisition. The presentation was flawless, the projections impeccable. Alexander spoke with his usual authority as he outlined their strategy, yet a part of his mind remained in a school art room where an 8-year-old girl was painting with her mother's talent. The timeline requires immediate action, the CFO emphasized. We need you in Singapore by Monday for at least 3 weeks, to oversee the transition personally. Monday. The art show was Friday. Alexander could attend the show and still make it to Singapore. But who would care for Olivia while he was gone? More importantly, what message would he be sending by leaving so soon after promising to be there for her? Mr. Reynolds? The board chairman's voice broke through his thoughts. Is the timeline acceptable? The old Alexander would have said yes without hesitation. Business always came first. But now, I need 24 hours, he said, surprising even himself. There are personal considerations I need to address. Confusion flickered across several faces. Alexander Reynolds never had personal considerations. That evening he found Olivia at the dining table, homework spread before her. She looked up briefly as he entered, then returned to her math problems. How was school today? He asked, setting down his briefcase. Fine, we had a quiz in science. I got an A. That's excellent, Alexander said, loosening his tie. Olivia, I need to talk to you about something. She set down her pencil, her face immediately guarded. Alexander recognized the expression. It was the same one he used when preparing for difficult negotiations. There's a business situation in Singapore, he began. It's important for the company. You have to go. She finished for him, her voice carefully neutral. It would be for about 3 weeks. Olivia nodded, turning back to her homework. Okay. Rebecca would stay with you, or we could arrange. It's fine, she interrupted. I understand. But her quick acceptance was worse than disappointment. It was resignation, the response of a child accustomed to adults putting other priorities first. Your art show is next Friday, Alexander said. I've marked it on my calendar. Olivia looked up, genuine surprise crossing her face before she carefully masked it. You don't have to come, it's not a big deal. It is to me, Alexander replied. For a fleeting moment, hope flashed in her eyes before experience tempered it. She shrugged and returned to her math problems. Later that night, Alexander stood at his office window looking out at the city where he'd built his empire. For the first time, the gleaming skyscrapers and strategic acquisitions seemed hollow. accomplishments compared to the simple trust in a child's eyes. The Alexander Reynolds who had existed 2 weeks ago would never have questioned his path. But that man had never held his daughter's hand after a nightmare, or seen his own eyes looking back at him, asking silently, "Will you be different from the others who left me?" Alexander stared at his laptop screen, eyes burning from fatigue. The Singapore acquisition documents blurred before him as he tried to balance preparing for the biggest deal of his career, while maintaining some semblance of presence for Olivia. For days, he'd been living a double life. Corporate titan during the day, awkward father figure at night. The delicate balance collapsed at 9:47 p.m. during a critical video conference with Singaporean investors, Mr. Reynolds, regarding the regulatory concerns in Section 12. The investor's voice cut through the quiet of Alexander's home office. A sudden cry from down the hall interrupted him. Alexander froze, his attention immediately split between the business opportunity worth billions and the sound of his daughter in distress. "Excuse me one moment," he said tersely, muting the call before rushing to Olivia's room. She was sitting upright in bed, face streaked with tears, breath coming in short gasps. "Another nightmare. Olivia," he said softly, sitting beside her. "It's all right. You're safe." "She was there," Olivia whispered. "Mom was there, and then she wasn't, and I couldn't find her anywhere." Alexander placed an awkward hand on her shoulder, acutely aware of the call waiting for him, of the millions hanging in the balance. It was just a dream. His earpiece buzzed insistently. The investors were getting impatient. "I need to finish a meeting," he said, already standing. "Try to go back to sleep. We'll talk in the morning." Olivia's face fell, but she nodded. "I'm sorry I interrupted." "It's fine," Alexander replied, already distracted by the buzzing earpiece. "Just please stay in bed this time." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. Olivia's expression shuddered closed, the brief vulnerability replaced by a careful blankness that was achingly familiar. It was his own defense mechanism reflected back at him. "I will," she said quietly, pulling the covers up. "Good night." Alexander returned to his call, forcing his focus back to acquisition terms and market projections. He secured the preliminary agreement, a victory that should have elated him. Instead, he felt hollow, the image of Olivia's closed expression haunting him. The following days brought a subtle but unmistakable shift. Olivia was unfailingly polite, answering his questions with yes or no whenever possible, keeping conversation minimal. She stopped sharing small details about school, stopped showing him her drawings. The fragile connection they had built seemed to disintegrate, leaving them as strangers sharing a space. When the child welfare caseworker arrived for her scheduled visit, Alexander was caught off guard. "This is standard procedure," Mrs. Chen explained, setting her briefcase on the coffee table. "I need to assess how Olivia is adjusting and ensure the living situation is appropriate." Alexander nodded, suddenly anxious in a way board meetings never made him feel. Of course. Mrs. Chen spoke with Olivia privately while Alexander waited in his office, pretending to work but actually straining to hear their muffled conversation. "Mr. Reynolds?" Mrs. Chen said afterward, her expression professional but concerned. "Olivia seems withdrawn. When I asked if she feels at home here, she couldn't give me a clear answer." Alexander's stomach clenched. "She's adjusting. We both are." "I understand," Mrs. Chen replied gently. "But children need stability and emotional availability. Your schedule appears extremely demanding, especially with this upcoming trip." "I'll be attending her art show before I leave," Alexander said. Defensively, Mrs. Chen made a note. "That's positive. However, I'm concerned about these 3 weeks away so early in your relationship. Have you considered that Olivia might interpret this as abandonment, especially after losing her mother?" The question struck Alexander with unexpected force. He hadn't considered it that way. He'd been thinking of the trip as a business necessity, not as another loss for Olivia. "I'll be video calling daily," he said weakly. Mrs. Chen's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Reynolds, Being a parent often means making difficult choices. Sometimes the right business decision isn't the right parenting decision. After she left, Alexander stood in the hallway outside Olivia's room listening to the silence. For the first time in his career, he wondered if success had come at too high a price, and if he was about to make the same mistake again. My name is Olivia Carter. At least it was until last week when Mr. Reynolds Alexander told me I could use his last name if I wanted to. I said I'd think about it. Mom would probably understand if I changed it. She always said that despite everything, he was still my father. I keep my special drawing hidden under my pillow. It's of Alexander and me holding hands, standing in front of this big glass building where we live. I worked really hard on it, but I'm afraid to show him. What if he doesn't like it? Or worse, what if he just says he likes it because he feels like he has to? Ms. Peterson, my art teacher, says I have talent. Just like your mother, she told me yesterday when I finished my painting for the showcase. It's a lighthouse on a cliff, the same one Mom and I visited last summer before she got too sick to travel. She'd said the lighthouse reminded her of Alexander, standing tall and guiding others, but always a little bit apart from everything else. Your painting has remarkable depth for someone your age, Ms. Peterson said, but I didn't tell her that I know all about depth. When you watch someone you love disappear a little more each day, you learn about the deepest kinds of feelings. I wonder if Alexander is going to leave too. Not like Mom did. I know that's different. But in his own way. He tries so hard sometimes, like when he makes breakfast or asks about school, but his phone is always buzzing and his mind seems far away. The night I had that bad dream and interrupted his meeting, I saw something in his eyes that scared me, like I was a problem he didn't know how to solve. Madison asked me at school today if it was cool having a billionaire dad. I just shrugged. How do you explain that you'd trade all the fancy stuff just to have someone who really wants you around? When that social worker lady came, she asked if I was happy here. I didn't know what to say. There are moments when it feels like maybe this could work, like when Alexander read to me or when he framed my drawing of him. But then I remember how Mom used to say that Alexander loved his work more than anything, and I see how he looks at his phone when it rings, like he's being pulled away from a temporary obligation back to his real life. The Singapore trip scares me. Miss Rebecca is nice, but she's not family. After he leaves, will he realize life is easier without an 8-year-old complicating everything? Mom always said I shouldn't expect too much from him. He has his own path, she'd tell me. But sometimes, at night, I still imagine what it would be like if he decided I was part of his path too. Yesterday, I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone about the Singapore trip. I understand the stakes, he said, sounding frustrated, but the timeline is problematic. Was he talking about me? Am I the problem with his timeline? I practice being perfect, keeping my room tidy, doing my homework without being asked, not making too much noise. I figure if I'm not trouble, maybe he'll want to keep me. But it's exhausting trying to be invisible and noticeable at the same time. The art show is next Friday. I didn't tell him it was important, but it is. Mom never missed a single school event even when she was using a wheelchair. I keep telling myself not to hope too much that Alexander will come, but there's this small part of me that can't help wondering, what if he does choose me over work, just this once? I took out the hidden drawing last night and added more details. A yaibo, small smile on his face, the sun shining above us. Ms. Peterson says art helps us create the world we wish to see. I'm not sure if that's true, but I keep drawing anyway. My mom once told me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make, every day. I wonder if Alexander knows that yet. Alexander stood in the boardroom, surrounded by expectant faces. The flight to Singapore was booked for Saturday morning. Contracts were prepared, and the entire future of Reynolds Enterprises hung in the balance. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The board has convened this emergency meeting. Chairman Walter Hargrove began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, to address concerns about the Singapore acquisition timeline. Alexander straightened his tie, already formulating his defense. He'd anticipated some pushback after requesting minor adjustments to accommodate Olivia's art show. To be blunt, Alexander, Walter continued, several board members have expressed concern about your commitment to this acquisition given your recent personal developments. A tense silence filled the room. Everyone present knew about Olivia now. The story had run in every business publication, complete with speculation about how Alexander's secret daughter might affect the company's future. My commitment to Reynolds Enterprises remains absolute, Alexander replied evenly. The slight schedule adjustment doesn't impact our strategic position. Richard Blackwell, the most aggressive board member, leaned forward. With respect, Alexander, this company wasn't built on slight schedule adjustments. It was built on absolute dedication and singular focus, qualities you've always embodied until now. The implication hung heavy in the air. Alexander felt a familiar surge of defensive pride. These men had watched him sacrifice everything for this company. They expected nothing less now. What exactly are you suggesting, Richard? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. We're suggesting, Walter interjected, that you need to make your priorities clear. Either commit fully to this acquisition, which means departing for Singapore tomorrow, and remaining for the required 3 weeks, or perhaps consider a temporary step back from operations during this adjustment period in your personal life. The ultimatum was delivered with corporate politeness, but Alexander recognized it for what it was. A threat. Prove your loyalty or lose your power. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated. The school's number flashed on the screen. Alexander rarely took calls during board meetings, but something, instinct perhaps, made him excuse himself. Mr. Reynolds, the school counselor's voice was calm but concerned. There's been an incident with Olivia. She became extremely upset during a family tree exercise in class. She's with me now, but she's asking for you. Alexander's chest tightened. I'll be there right away. He returned to the boardroom, already reaching for his suit jacket. Gentlemen, I need to leave. Family emergency. Richard scoffed audibly. This is exactly what concerns us. Alexander paused at the door, something shifting fundamentally inside him. This meeting is adjourned until tomorrow. I'll have my decision for you then. 30 minutes later, Alexander was sitting in the school counselor's office where Olivia sat curled. In a chair, her small frame turned inward, eyes red from crying. What happened? He asked gently. The counselor explained. The class was creating family trees. When another student asked why Olivia was only drawing herself and her mother, a rather insensitive discussion ensued about absent fathers and orphans. Alexander winced, imagining Olivia facing those questions alone. Can we go home? Olivia whispered, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. Home. Not your house or the apartment. Home. The significance wasn't lost on Alexander. The drive back was quiet until Olivia finally spoke. Are you mad that you had to leave work? Alexander glanced at her, surprised. No, why would you think that? She shrugged, looking out the window. Mom said your work was the most important thing to you. The words stung because they had been true. For years, nothing had mattered more than building his empire, proving himself, accumulating success and power. Things change, Olivia, he said carefully. People change. Back at the penthouse, Alexander made hot chocolate, something his own mother had done for him as a child. They sat together at the kitchen counter, an unlikely pair finding comfort in the simple ritual. I didn't know what to put on my family tree, Olivia admitted, her fingers curled around her mug. The other kids have grandparents and siblings and pets. I just had Mom. And now? Her voice trailed off, the unspoken loss hanging between them. Now you have me, Alexander said softly. Olivia looked up, studying him with those piercing blue eyes, so like his own. For how long? The question cut through all pretense, all corporate diplomatic language. This was the true negotiation, the one that actually mattered. For as long as you need me, he answered. For always. Even if it means missing important business things? Alexander thought about the board meeting, the ultimatum, the Singapore deal, all the trappings of success he'd spent his life pursuing. Then he looked at this small, fierce person who carried his blood and Vanessa's spirit, who had already lost too much. Yes, he said with certainty. Even then. That night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Alexander sat in his office staring at the framed drawing she had made of him. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Board members, investors, the Singapore team, all demanding answers, commitments, decisions. Rebecca appeared in the doorway. "The board is expecting your decision by morning." Alexander nodded. "I know." "Sir." She hesitated, then continued with unusual candor. "I've worked with you for 7 years. I've never seen you waver on a business decision before." "I've never had a daughter before," he replied simply. Rebecca smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice, whichever one it is." After she left, Alexander picked up his phone and dialed Walter's number. When the chairman answered, Alexander spoke with the same decisive tone he'd used to build his company. "I'll be attending my daughter's art show on Friday. After that, I'll join the team in Singapore via video conference. My physical presence isn't required for this acquisition to succeed, and you know it." There was a long pause. Before Walter replied, "The board won't be pleased." "Then they can vote me out," Alexander said calmly. "But I suspect our shareholders would prefer a CEO who can innovate around obstacles, rather than simply bulldoze through them." He ended the call feeling lighter than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring consequences, perhaps severe ones. But for tonight, Alexander Reynolds knew with absolute certainty that he had passed the true test. Alexander stood in the doorway of Olivia's bedroom, watching as she carefully organized her art supplies for the upcoming showcase. Her small hands moved with precision, arranging brushes by size and paints by color, a methodical approach that reminded him of himself. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked. Olivia looked up, her expression guarded but hopeful. "I think so. Miss Peterson says my painting is one of the best in the class." "I'm not surprised," Alexander replied, entering the room. He sat on the edge of her bed, noticing how the space had transformed over the past weeks. What had been a sterile guest room now held evidence of life, drawings pinned to walls, books stacked on nightstands, a stuffed bear nestled among pillows. "The board didn't fire you?" Olivia asked suddenly. Alexander blinked, startled by the direct question. "You knew about that?" She nodded. "I heard you talking to Miss Rebecca. She said they might be really angry." "They were," he admitted. "Still are, actually. But no, they didn't fire me. Because you're too important?" Alexander considered this. "Partially, but also because I found a different solution. A way to do the Singapore work without actually being in Singapore." Olivia seemed to contemplate this. "A compromise." "Exactly." She returned to organizing her supplies, but Alexander sensed something still troubled her. "What's on your mind, Olivia?" She hesitated, then reached under her pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made this, but wasn't sure if you'd want it." Alexander accepted the drawing, carefully unfolding it. His breath caught at the image, Olivia and himself holding hands in front of their building, the sun shining above them. It was simple yet powerful in its hope. "This is," he searched for the right word, "perfect." For the first time since her nightmare, Olivia's smile reached her eyes. "Really?" "Really." Alexander studied the drawing again. "Why wouldn't I want it?" She shrugged, suddenly finding her art supplies fascinating again. "Mom always said you like to keep your personal life separate from everything else." The observation, so accurate and yet so damning, made Alexander wince. Vanessa had understood him perfectly, perhaps better than he'd understood himself. "Your mother was right about many things," he said carefully. "But people can change. Olivia, I'm trying to." That evening, Alexander did something unprecedented. He left work early and took Olivia for ice cream in the park. As they sat on a bench watching joggers and dog walkers pass by, Alexander found himself telling her about his own childhood, the strict father who valued achievement above all else, the pressure to succeed, the loneliness of being taught that emotions were weaknesses. Is that why you work so much? Olivia asked, licking her chocolate cone. Partly, Alexander admitted. When you spend your whole life trying to prove yourself, it's hard to know when to stop. Mom said you were probably lonely in your big building. Alexander nearly choked on his ice cream. She said that? Olivia nodded. She wasn't mad at you, she just said you hadn't figured out the important stuff yet. Alexander stared at his daughter, amazed at how clearly Vanessa had seen through his carefully constructed facade of success. And here was their child, carrying her mother's wisdom and insight, offering him a chance at redemption he didn't deserve but desperately needed. She was right, he said softly. I was lonely. I just didn't know it. Later that night, Alexander moved Olivia's drawing from his desk to the living room wall, a prominent spot visible to anyone who entered. It wasn't just art, it was a declaration, a promise, a new identity taking shape. When Rebecca arrived, the next morning with acquisition documents requiring his signature, she noticed the drawing immediately. Nice artwork, she commented. My daughter made it, Alexander replied, the words feeling right in a way nothing in business ever had. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Alexander adjusted his tie in the mirror. Today was important, Olivia's art showcase at Westridge Academy, followed by the announcement of his compromise plan for the Singapore acquisition. He'd prepared meticulously for both, determined to honor his commitments as both a father and CEO. Are you nervous? He asked, finding Olivia in the kitchen dressed in a blue dress they'd chosen together for the occasion. She nodded, fidgeting with a piece of toast. What if nobody likes my painting? Then they have terrible taste in art, Alexander replied, with a confidence that made her smile. But that won't happen, your work is exceptional. The moment felt normal, domestic, a father reassuring his daughter before a big day. Alexander marveled at how natural such interactions were becoming, when just weeks ago he'd been paralyzed by uncertainty around her. His phone buzzed. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. Mr. Reynolds, her voice was tense. There's a situation you need to address immediately. Can it wait until after the showcase? Alexander asked, glancing at Olivia. I'm afraid not. Carter Williams is here with legal documents. He's claiming to be Vanessa's brother and is filing for custody of Olivia. Alexander's blood ran cold. I'll be right there. Tell them nothing until I arrive. He ended the call, mind racing. Vanessa had rarely spoken of her family. They'd disowned her when she pursued art instead of the family business. In all their time together, Alexander had never met any of them. Is everything okay? Olivia asked, noticing his expression. Alexander hesitated, then knelt to her level. There's an issue at the office I need to handle before your showcase. Rebecca will take you to school, and I promise I'll be there before your presentation. Olivia's face fell slightly, but she nodded with that resigned acceptance that broke his heart. It's okay if you can't make it, I understand. I will be there, Alexander said firmly. That's a promise. In his office downtown, Alexander faced Carter Williams, a sharp-featured man whose cold demeanor contrasted sharply with Vanessa's warmth. Mr. Reynolds, Williams began without preamble. I'm here to rectify a situation that should never have occurred. My niece belongs with family, not with a stranger who didn't acknowledge her existence for 8 years. Alexander maintained his composure with effort. Where were you when Vanessa was sick? When Olivia needed family most? Williams's expression hardened. My sister chose her path. However, blood remains blood, and Olivia is a Williams. Our family has the resources and stability to raise her properly. You mean control her the way you tried to control Vanessa? Alexander countered. You have no legal claim beyond temporary guardianship, Williams replied, sliding documents across the desk. Our petition cites your demanding career, your lack of parenting experience, and the improper circumstances of Olivia's current living situation. Alexander's lawyer reviewed the papers with a grim expression. They're requesting an emergency hearing next week. They've been thorough, citing your travel schedule, work hours, and recent board conflicts as evidence of instability. They've been watching us, Alexander realized. The photographers, the news stories, they hadn't just been tabloid fodder, they'd been ammunition. I'll fight this, Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. With everything I have. You'll lose. Williams replied coldly. The courts favor blood relatives, especially ones with traditional family structures. My wife and I have raised 3 children. What experience do you have beyond the past few weeks of playing house? The accusation stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Alexander had been a father for less than a month. What right did he have to claim he knew what was best for Olivia? But then he thought of her nightmares, her careful smile, her drawings, the way she'd begun to trust him, tentatively and bravely. He thought of his promise just this morning, and all the promises he intended to keep in the years ahead. You may be blood, Alexander said quietly, but you are not her family. I am. After Williams left, Alexander's lawyer didn't mince words. This won't be easy. Their case has merit from a traditional legal perspective. Alexander checked his watch. The showcase began in 40 minutes. Prepare whatever we need, I have somewhere to be right now. He arrived at Westridge Academy with minutes to spare, slipping into the auditorium where children's artwork lined the walls. He found Olivia standing nervously beside her painting, the lighthouse on a cliff, standing strong against an approaching storm. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. You came, she said, relief washing over her face. I promised I would. Alexander knelt beside her. This is extraordinary, Olivia. Her painting truly was remarkable. The perspective, the use of light, the emotional resonance far beyond her years. A small crowd had gathered around it, including the art teacher who beamed proudly. She has her mother's gift, Ms. Peterson told Alexander. Vanessa would be so proud. As Olivia explained her painting to judges and visitors, Alexander noticed her confidence growing. She was in her element here, expressing through art what she couldn't always say in words. Watching her, he felt a fierce protectiveness unlike anything he'd ever known. When her name was called for first place in her age group, Alexander's applause was the loudest in the room. The smile Olivia gave him as she accepted her ribbon was worth more than any business deal he'd ever closed. Later that evening, as they celebrated with ice cream at home, Alexander knew he needed to tell her about the custody challenge. She deserved honesty. Olivia, he began carefully, there's something we need to discuss. Your mother's brother has come forward. He wants you to live with him and his family. Olivia went still, her spoon halfway to her mouth. I have an uncle? Apparently so, Alexander confirmed. He says he thinks you should be with blood relatives. Did Mom ever talk about him? Alexander hesitated. Not much. They weren't close. Olivia set down her spoon, her expression troubled. Do I have to go with him? No, Alexander said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it, but there will be meetings with lawyers, maybe even a judge. They'll ask you questions about living here with me. She nodded slowly, processing this. Will they ask if I'm happy? Probably. And if I say yes? That I want to stay with you? Alexander's throat tightened. That will help, but it's complicated. They'll consider many factors. Olivia was quiet for a long moment, then asked in a small voice, What if they make me leave? Alexander reached across the table and took her hand. Olivia, I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to keep you here, where you belong. Some people think DNA is what makes a family, but they're wrong. Family is about who stands by you, who cares for you, who puts you first, like you did today, she said softly. Coming to my showcase even with all the problems. Exactly like that, Alexander agreed. And that's what I'll keep doing no matter what. That night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Alexander sat in his office making calls to the best family law attorneys in the country. The custody battle would be difficult, perhaps the greatest challenge he'd ever faced. The Williams family had money, influence, and the weight of traditional values on their side. But Alexander Reynolds had never backed down from a fight, and he'd never fought for anything as important as this. When Rebecca called with the board's response to his Singapore compromise, Alexander was brief. Tell them to handle it however they see fit. I have a more pressing priority right now. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reynolds wasn't just building an empire, he was fighting for his family. The courtroom felt sterile and cold as Alexander straightened his tie and prepared for the most important negotiation of his life. Unlike the boardroom, where he commanded absolute authority, here he was just another petitioner at the mercy of the system. For 2 weeks, the custody battle had consumed every aspect of his life. Board meetings were delegated, the Singapore acquisition moved forward without his direct involvement, and for the first time in Reynolds Enterprises' history, Alexander had formally activated his emergency succession plan, naming Rebecca as acting CEO while he focused solely on keeping Olivia. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. Alexander stood, glancing at Olivia, who sat with her court-appointed advocate in the front row. She looked small in her navy dress, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her eyes wide as she took in the imposing room. Carter Williams and his wife presented a picture-perfect image of traditional family values. Their attorney wasted no time establishing their qualifications. "Your Honor, my clients have raised 3 successful children. They have a stable marriage, strong community ties, and a family home with space for Olivia to thrive. Most importantly, they share blood ties with the child, ties that Mr. Reynolds does not and cannot claim." When Williams himself took the stand, he spoke with practiced sincerity. "We simply want what's best for our niece. Mr. Reynolds is a businessman first and foremost. His lifestyle involves extensive travel, unpredictable hours, and a singular focus on corporate success that leaves little room for parenting." Alexander's attorney countered with evidence of the changes he'd made: the modified work schedule, the permanent guardianship petition, the college fund established in Olivia's name. Yet Alexander could see doubt in the judge's eyes. When his turn came to testify, Alexander abandoned the carefully prepared statement his lawyers had crafted. Instead, he spoke directly from his heart. "Your Honor, I'm not going to pretend I'm a perfect father. 8 weeks ago, I didn't even know I had a daughter. I've made mistakes, plenty of them. I've been learning on the job every single day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. But there's something the Williams family doesn't understand. Being a parent isn't about perfection, it's about choice. Every day since Olivia came into my life, I've chosen her. I've chosen to be there for her. Nightmares to learn which breakfast cereal she prefers, to sit through animated movies I don't understand. Alexander turned slightly toward Olivia, whose eyes never left his face. "I chose to attend her art showcase instead of flying to Singapore for the biggest deal of my career. I chose to step back from running my company to fight for her in this courtroom, and if given the chance, I'll keep choosing her, over business, over money, over everything, for the rest of my life." He turned back to the judge. "The Williams family may share Olivia's DNA, but they don't know that she sleeps with her mother's photograph next to her bed. They don't know that she hums when she paints just like Vanessa did. They don't know that she's brave and kind, and smarter than most adults I know." His voice caught slightly. "They claim blood makes them family, but they weren't there when Vanessa was dying. They weren't there when Olivia had no one. I may have entered her life late, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The courtroom fell silent when he finished. Even Williams looked uncomfortable. The pivotal moment came when Rebecca unexpectedly requested to testify. She presented a timeline chronicling Alexander's transformation, from the moment he'd received Olivia's note through each subsequent choice he'd made to prioritize his daughter. "I've worked with Mr. Reynolds for 7 years," she concluded. "In that time, I've watched him build an empire with single-minded focus. But nothing, not closing billion-dollar deals or winning industry awards, has ever made him as genuinely happy as being Olivia's father." When the judge called a brief recess to consider her ruling, Alexander knelt before Olivia in the hallway. "No matter what happens," he promised, "we'll face it together." For the first time since the custody battle began, Olivia wrapped her arms around his neck. "I know," she whispered. Alexander stood in the doorway of Olivia's room, coffee mug in hand, watching as the morning sunlight filtered through curtains they had chosen together. The space looked nothing like it had 2 months ago. Walls now, painted a soft blue, shelves filled with books and art supplies, a bulletin board covered with drawings and mementos. It was no longer just a room in his house. It was Olivia's sanctuary. Olivia sat cross-legged on her bed, sketching intently, her blonde hair falling across her face in a way that reminded him so much of Vanessa it made his chest ache. She hadn't noticed him yet, too absorbed in her creation. The past week since the court's ruling had brought a peace neither of them had experienced before. Judge Martinez had granted Alexander permanent custody, citing Olivia's clear preference and the extraordinary effort and adaptation Alexander had demonstrated. The Williams family had retreated, humbled by the testimony and evidence of Alexander's commitment. "Morning, artist," Alexander said softly. Olivia looked up, her face brightening. "I'm making something for your office." "Another masterpiece for my collection?" He smiled, entering the room. She nodded but kept the sketchbook angled away. "It's a surprise." His phone buzzed in his pocket, the 4th time in the past hour. The board was eager for his full return. The Singapore acquisition was proceeding faster than anticipated, and investors were clamoring for reassurance that Reynolds Enterprises remained in capable hands. Alexander silenced the device without checking the message. "Pancakes?" he suggested instead. "With blueberries?" Olivia's eyes lit up. "Is there any other way?" In the kitchen, they moved in an easy rhythm that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. Olivia measured ingredients while Alexander heated the griddle. As they worked, he considered how profoundly his priorities had shifted. The corporate titan who once scheduled his life in 15-minute increments now happily spent an hour making oddly shaped pancakes with an 8-year-old. The man who had demanded perfection from everyone around him now celebrated the beautiful messiness of family life. "Do you have important meetings today?" Olivia asked, carefully dropping blueberries into the batter. Alexander flipped a pancake before answering. "Nothing that can't wait." "Because of me?" There was a hint of worry in her voice. Alexander turned to face her. "Because I've realized something, Olivia. Work will always be there. The company will survive if I take a morning off. But these moments, making breakfast with you, hearing about your day, watching you grow, these moments won't wait." Olivia considered this, her expression serious. "Mom used to say time is the most valuable thing you can give someone." "Your mother was very wise," Alexander said softly. As they ate breakfast, Olivia handed him a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you." Alexander opened it to find a carefully drawn family tree. Unlike the school assignment that had caused her so much distress, this one was different. At the top was Vanessa, her name surrounded by small painted flowers. Below were Alexander and Olivia, their names connected with intricately drawn branches. "It's beautiful," he said, tracing the lines with his finger. "Ms. Peterson helped me. She said family trees can look however we want them to look." Olivia pointed to a small inscription at the bottom. "This part is Mom's handwriting." In the corner was a quote Alexander recognized from one of Vanessa's letters. "Love isn't found in grand gestures but in daily choices." "I found it in her journal," Olivia explained. "I think she would be happy now." Alexander felt the weight of those words. The forgiveness offered, the acceptance given, the family somehow formed despite everything. That afternoon, Alexander made the decision he'd been contemplating for weeks. He called a board meeting and announced his intention to restructure his role at Reynolds Enterprises. He would remain as chairman, providing strategic direction, but would step back from day-to-day operations to focus on being a father. "Some of you may see this as stepping back," he told the stunned board members. "I see it as stepping forward into what truly matters." Later, as the sun began to set, Alexander and Olivia stood on the balcony of their penthouse looking out at the city, lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "Do you miss working all the time?" Olivia asked, leaning against the railing. Alexander considered the question. "I miss the certainty sometimes. Business problems have solutions. People are more complicated." "Like me?" she asked with a small, Smile. Especially you, he teased, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. But that's what makes it worth it. Olivia's expression grew serious. I miss Mom a lot sometimes. I know, Alexander said softly. I wish I'd been there sooner, for both of you. But you're here now, she replied simply. In that moment, Alexander Reynolds, who had spent decades building towers of glass and steel, accumulating wealth and power, and believing those things defined success, finally understood what true richness meant. It wasn't found in boardrooms or bank accounts. It lived in pancake breakfasts and art projects and bedtime stories and small hands reaching for his, in second chances he hadn't deserved but had been given anyway. As Olivia slipped her hand into his, Alexander looked out at the empire he had built, then down at the little girl who had changed everything. The choice between them was no choice at all. His greatest achievement would never be listed on any financial report or business magazine. It was standing right beside him, holding, his hand showing him what it meant to truly come home.